I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. On Wednesday, May 11th, the day Mo Wilson was murdered, Colin Strickland and Caitlin Armstrong started their morning by riding bikes to the Meteor on South Congress. By the way, I'm reading from an article by Ian Dill on from Outside Online. I'll put a link to the article. It's a really long article, but a great read. I'll put that in the description. The article goes on to say, Colin had made plans to meet his friend Bob Koplos, a fellow gravel racer, for a 4-hour training ride. This was on May 11th. Armstrong accompanied them for the ride, but on a hill just a few miles outside town, she couldn't hold the pace. Strickland told Koplos they needn't wait and that Caitlin wouldn't expect them to, and so they kept going. I don't think she wanted to be left behind. I don't think Caitlin wanted to be replaced. And of course, with Mo in the picture, both were likely to happen. She'd be left behind and replaced. I don't know if you've ever ridden a bicycle in a situation like that and you left behind and the group goes on in front of you and, the people are sort of chatting to one another. And not only are you behind, you are left to battle the wind by yourself. It's really not a fun, it's humiliating on a bunch of levels. And that is in a way a symbolic precursor to what literally felt like was happening to Caitlin later that day, where Colin left her behind again and, took Mo to the pool, took Mo to dinner. And of course, Caitlin was aware of this. Now, going back to the article, quote, the day before, when Wilson had reached out to let Strickland know that she was coming to Austin, he decided to delete the old text thread with her and change her name in his phone's contacts. He thought that concealing these things from Armstrong would help him avoid conflict. What he didn't take into account was that his text messages also showed up on his laptop, which usually sat open on the kitchen table. And guess what? Armstrong had the password. That's also a quote from that article. I think it's very likely that the fuel for Caitlin's rage came from the crushing invalidation she must have felt secretly eavesdropping on her boyfriend's dream-coming-true life. She wanted to be part of it. She did want him to wait for her. And she saw that he wasn't. And she saw who she was being replaced with. Now, during the sentencing hearing, Mo Wilson's mother, Karen, addressed Caitlin Armstrong directly in court. She said, that violent act on May 11th was cowardly because you never chose to face her woman to woman in a civil conversation. She would have listened. She was an amazing listener. She would have cared about your feelings. If you allowed yourself to actually know her, you never ever would have wanted to hurt her. This never would have happened. You and Colin could have had a beautiful life together. I'm not sure how much of that is true. I'm not sure whether, if Mo wasn't even in the picture, whether Colin and Caitlin would have lived happily ever after. On one occasion at a dinner in Bentonville during the Cyclocross World Championships, the three of them actually sat beside one another. Colin in the middle, Caitlin on one side, Mo on the other side. Armstrong called Wilson actually so many times that Wilson eventually blocked her number. So I don't think it's a case that if you allowed yourself to actually know her, or if you chose to face her woman to woman, they faced one another woman to woman many times, not necessarily talking to one another, but glancing at one another and certainly aware of one another. And of course, there was a confrontation where Caitlin did go to the trouble to talk to Mo. And so I think if we want to wave a magic wand and undo this tragedy, I don't think the answer is asking Caitlin and Mo to talk to one another, woman to woman. Because as I say, they did just that, and how often can you expect that in other relationships? So what is the answer? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Welcome to the dozens of you who have subscribed recently. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. Well, let's deal with the perfect storm. You know, the timeline in this case is one of the most complicated I've seen in true crime, especially if you go into it in a lot of detail, certainly as Ian Dillon has done, and that's why his article is so long. It is similar in some ways to the Laurie Vallow case. It's complicated because the timeline doesn't just involve one or two people, but three. And it's also not just one chronological series of events, but many strands weaving in, locking in this business, that kind of sporting event, the financial narrative, the emotional narrative. There's so many kind of aspects to it. And while other strands kind of break apart, they kind of reattach later on as well. That's another aspect of the on-again, off-again thing that's taking place. So yes, it's hard to do justice to the timeline without writing a book about it. What does become crystal clear, as you're about to see, is the agitating, escalating inevitability of it. And I've gotten much of the elements of this timeline from Ian Dill's article in Outside. So, for example, in October 2019, this is really where their relationship starts. Obviously, there's a backstory to each of these three, but essentially, Colin's world and Caitlin's world come together, collide, after Colin downloads Hinge, a dating app geared towards singles looking for real connections. It's kind of like the anti-Tinder app. It's kind of for serious people who want serious relationships. In 2020, COVID hit, and that kind of nixed the gravel riding circuit and artificially created a kind of a timeout and a space in Strickland's racing career for Armstrong to park, and that's exactly what she did. In February 2021, just as COVID begins to loosen its grip, an ice storm struck Texas. According to the article, quote, the pipes in Armstrong's apartment burst, making the place uninhabitable. Armstrong stayed with Strickland while repairs were made. So these are the factors that kind of get her into his home and them living together. When she asked about living together full-time, he was hesitant. For half of every year, his mom lived with him in his 4-bedroom home. More important, he worried about the emotional dependency that living with Armstrong might create for both of them. And isn't that exactly what happened? She became emotionally dependent, and so did he, in some ways. Then in late October 2021, a few days after he'd ended things with Armstrong, according to this article, Strickland got a message from Mo. She said that she was coming to Austin to hang out with friends for a week, and did they want to get together? Do you see the pattern? Do you see that Caitlin is kicked to the curb, and guess who swoops into town before the dust has even settled? Back to the article, quote, around the same time as Armstrong was working to get a real estate license, she began investing in property. So it's during this period that she's with Strickland, she gets interested in property, she gets a real estate license, and guess what? One thing leads to another, and they buy a house together in Lockhart, thereby locking them in to at least one kind of relationship. They kind of get woven in together. And it's partly because they're living together that they buy this house together. And Armstrong bought 2 homes in South Austin, including one in Strickland's neighborhood. They spent hours planning modern renovations to that house, including a custom steel fence Armstrong had installed. Her goal was to move into the place once the renovations were done in 6 months or so. But more than a year after Armstrong had moved in with Strickland, they were still living together. So why is that? Whose fault is that she didn't move out? They'd formed a business, according to the article, called Wheelhouse Mobile, or probably, is it mobile or mobile? Probably Wheelhouse Mobile. And that involved restoring and selling customized Spartan trailers. According to Ian Dill's article, Armstrong became an agent for Sotheby's, that's a realtor, where they could sell the trailers for as much as, or is that an auction house, $350,000 each. Seemingly without thinking about it, almost every element of their lives became intertwined. That's such a good point made by the writer here, that just in almost every way their lives were becoming intertwined, in terms of business, in terms of living arrangements, in terms of lifestyle and kind of financial management. She was managing Wheelhouse Mobile and his racing finances. She also had access to his phone and computer passwords. All of those, well, those would later turn out to be, I guess, a big mistake. According to the article, people liked Strickland and Armstrong. They liked them as a couple, but a lot of them said, well, their relationship seems to be messy. And also some people felt that Armstrong was becoming a little bit too interested, a little too attached to his public persona. But what does that actually mean? Well, again, Outside Online's Ian Dill explains, and he gives this really interesting example referring to the clothing sponsor, Rafa, that's the cycling clothing sponsor. They gave him an exclusive cycling kit, and then he ordered one for Armstrong as well. And this gives you just a sense of how casually this intertwining can happen. And then further down the road, how you get kind of caught up and tied up in those knots. So he gives the same exclusive cycling kit to Armstrong. He gives it to her as a gift. He asks her not to wear it at public events. So you can train with me, you can train on your own, but in a kind of a public setting, like a public race, a sponsored event, please don't wear it. He thought that that would be improper because she's not actually sponsored by Rafa. His sponsors might not like it. And so the morning of the ride, when Armstrong came out dressed in the kit, Strickland asked her to change. And so she was stung by that. Everyone else gets to wear whatever they're wearing, and she may not. And so she skips the ride entirely, and she's once again left out. She's once again dropped from the bunch. According to the article, the two of them were still working on cutting ties. Armstrong was looking for an apartment, and again, just showing all these forces that are coming into alignment. Those are specifically not easy to find in Austin. And so she just continued living with Strickland. Can't find an apartment. And so she was apparently staying in a separate room. And Colin stressed this, that when he met Mo, Caitlin was living in a different room. They weren't sleeping in the same room. The renovations on her house were coming along, so she could move there soon, according to the article. Meanwhile, Armstrong told Strickland that she didn't want to be part of Wheelhouse Mobile anymore. So you can see, again, how this timeline is sort of shifting, shape shifts. Yeah, the strand breaks. Now, I don't want to be part of Wheelhouse Mobile. And then he says he wishes she would stay on, but he understands. And then he feels her absence, and he feels that he needs her, and he feels that it does need to be managed, and it's gonna use up his time, and he needs her energy on this. Anyway, over the holidays in late 2021 and 22, Strickland and Armstrong started to reconnect. And so that's another thing. You've got this space, you've got time. What do you do with it? Well, Armstrong doesn't have anywhere to go for Thanksgiving. So what happens? He invites her to dinner at a friend's home, and they reconnect. Also, the group that they involved with, they like Armstrong. Strickland's friends are happy to have her around. So it's easy. It's like a path of least resistance for things just to come back together. And probably the same thing happened over Christmas and New Year's. Armstrong's got nowhere to go. Her sister's in New York. Her family's all over the place. Well, spend Christmas with me, and that's what happens. According to the article, during the first weekend of November 2021, Strickland and Wilson drove to West Texas, where they went on 3 long rides with a small group of Strickland's friends. Now, this is a situation where Strickland is training, and that's how he encounters Wilson. Strickland is racing, and that's how he encounters Wilson. She keeps coming back into his life because of cycling, and that's one area that Armstrong can't really participate in or can't keep up with. And so Armstrong decides, I'm going to get away, and she books a trip to Mexico. So Wilson's in the picture, and Armstrong decides, I'm going away. And this is in a way a precursor to May 11th and her flight to Costa Rica. Wilson comes there and she then goes to Costa Rica. It's easy to imagine very few instances of Mo and Caitlin crossing swords or indeed crossing paths. And Mo's mother implies by saying, if only you had met her, if only you knew her. But that was the problem. Caitlin had met her and had been found wanting by Colin and likely by herself as well. So how can we magic this tragedy away? Well, I don't think by asking them to have a nice conversation. I don't think that's realistic. Or asking them to be reasonable, or asking them to calm down. Instead, I've got two suggestions. The one is to do, and both of them kind of have to do not with Caitlin or with Mo, it's to do with Colin or someone else or something else, right? In October 2019, Colin Strickland downloaded Hinge, a dating app geared towards singles looking for a real connection. So why does he download this app, looks for a real connection, finds the real connection, and then after that he's not sure if he wants it? If you think about it, Colin's number one flaw is he can't seem to commit to anyone or anything. If he simply committed to Caitlin or Mo, right? If he's simply committed to something or someone, then the problem is solved. If he's committed to his cycling, and only that, problem solved. Committed to Caitlin and only Caitlin, problem solved. Committed to Mo, problem solved. Or if he'd just been honest that he wasn't ready for a real connection and met floozies on Tinder instead, we would never have met Caitlin. And that would have been fine too. I think besides not being able to commit, it's about wanting your cake and eating it. And I may be reading too much into it. I'm really not, these are people that you may not know very well, but we do know that Colin's mother living with him for 6 months of the year, it's a 30-something person. That's quite late to be living half a year with your mother. And that may have led to him being something of a coddled individual. I think mothers can't help mothering. And perhaps that kind of transition leads to him being something of a mama's boy. And so he's a kind of a Superman, this incredibly strong rider and this hero, but also kind of a mama's boy and a little bit pathetic in that sense. And isn't that why he can't decide things, he can't commit to things, because someone's always making these decisions for him, or often making decisions for him. And isn't that because he hasn't yet come out of the parental shadow as a 30-something? So I'm asking the question, I don't know. Does this explain something? According to Ian Dill, he often worried that a deep emotional attachment could be counterproductive to his cycling ambitions. But that year, following his most successful racing season yet, he felt a renewed urgency to meet someone he could get serious about. And of course, more successes were waiting in the wings for him and Mo, which drew them closer together. And it was on this hinge that tears began to form between Colin and Caitlin, the cycling hinge. According to the article, during the first months they dated, Strickland considered breaking it off before things got too far along. But Armstrong's kindness, patience, and positivity, all kind of traits that maybe felt a little like he got from his mother. Kindness, sensitivity, someone kind of looking after him, managing things for him, so he doesn't cut ties. In other words, her mothering, her managing, and him going into the strangely contradictory psychology of someone who's kind of a boy man and a hero but not yet a man, and that's perhaps why he struggles to let go of things. According to the article, Strickland could be extremely condescending to people who he knows and is close to. And perhaps this condescension was kind of a license to those around him to condescend to threats and rivals as well. Think about sport, very competitive sport. It's about threats and rivals. And sometimes some of the best athletes are arrogant and condescending because it's the way they survive the fear of dealing with real threats. But then what if someone close to you who's not in a sports psychology thinks in the same condescending way. I've got to get rid of her. Now think about someone in a cycling race who says, I've got to get rid of this guy. This guy who's riding in my slipstream. This guy who I'm trying to shake him off. I've got to get rid of him. Now, think about that kind of condescending attitude in a relationship, in a romantic situation. But now we come to the part that I'm sure at least half of you either don't want to hear or won't want to hear. With a flick of a magic wand, if we wanted to easily magic this tragedy back to happily ever after, easily, all we need to do is get rid of the guns. Just like that. Just like that. Right? As Outside Online's Ian Dill so eloquently puts it, in the cloistered cycling community, gun violence is almost unheard of. So here's my argument. If a triggered, fuming, angry, jealous Caitlin had been taken over by the dragon and she didn't have access to a gun, what would have happened? She's extremely angry. She wants to kill. Nothing's going to get in her way. Well, what's she going to do? She doesn't have a gun. Do you know what she's going to do? Nothing. What, is she going to drive her car up the stairs through the kitchen and run Mo over? Or would she have dressed like Black Mamba and headed over to Mo's with a Hanzo sword?
Silly Caucasian girl likes to play with samurai swords.
Well, playing with guns is also just as silly. Back to the article, people get angry, they get hurt, they feel desperate all the time. People are triggered in serious ways. Many times people feel unhinged. They look for a solution to bring their pain to an abrupt end. It might be pain in their own hearts or pain that's directed to someone else. According to Ian Dill, a gun makes it very easy for them to hurt themselves or someone else. More guns equals more gun deaths. And not just of criminals, less than 2% of violent crime is deterred through the use of a handgun. That's the end of the quoted section. Think about it, without a gun, that moment of desperation, that darkest hour, it simply passes. And the next morning, the painful world is simply, well, it's somehow lessened, simply thanks to a change in the weather, a change in the ether, or a little perspective. This horrible moment that you feel trapped in simply just passes. I'm not going to take it further than that, except to say, previously I've said that the lesson in the story is to know when to quit. Well, we also need to know when to quit the absolute defense of gun ownership. If you disagree with that, then be prepared to live with the consequences. And the consequences are this, that there will be many more Mo Wilsons and more Colin Stricklands. And one fine day, you will be one of them. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.